Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Albert Chiu. Facing Trump 2.0, Taiwan President Lai Ching-te convened the first high-level national security meeting of the year, announcing that the government will prioritize a special budget to ensure that defense spending surpasses 3% of GDP, which translates to an annual defense budget of approximately 26 billion or NT 780 billion. What are the political considerations behind this decision? How might the dynamics between the U.S., China, and Taiwan evolve? Joining us today are Arthur Ding, National Chengchi University Professor Emeritus, and Wang Kai-chun, KMT Department of International Affairs Assistant Director. A very warm welcome to both on the show. Let's take a look at other countries facing external threats, such as Israel and South Korea. Israel's defense budget generally accounts for 4.8% to 5% of its GDP, while South Korea, facing the threat from North Korea, maintains its defense budget at around 3% of GDP. Taiwan's defense budget has fluctuated over the years. In 2008, it accounted for 3% of GDP, but was reduced to 2.1% during President Ma Ying-jeou's administration before gradually increasing again. In 2024, the defense budget reached 2.38% of GDP, and the cabinet approved a 2.45% allocation for 2025. Looking ahead, how can Taiwan achieve its 3% target? So my first question goes to Mr. Wang. So how should President Lai Ching-te's policy of increasing the defense budget be interpreted?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the question. And, one of the typical first thing I would say is these are all my personal point of view, but also I think it will be informed speculations. I do think, our country, the defense has long needed a major boost in its capacity and also its manpower. So I'm very glad that the president actually gave up a numerical goal in terms of where we're going to reach. But in terms of, how we can reach that target, that is up for debate. And I do believe that the president has a lot of negotiations and conversations that he needs to do when it comes to communicating with the opposition majority. And I would say when it comes to pressure, for example, I think Taiwan is under pressure, not by the United States or any external forces. I would say primarily by our own defense conditions, right? So we are facing accumulative challenges when it comes to shortcomings in manpower, when it comes to how many weapons or articles we can actually put into battle order. So those are the kind of things that I do believe we need to solve. And I do believe that the potential increase of defense budget has to focus on those issues.
Mm-hmm. So, Professor Ding, what about you? Do you think that this kind of push for President Lai to increase the defense budget is kind of an inevitable kind of destiny for Taiwan in the future? Or is there any broader strategic intent behind it, to your perspective?
We are faced a tremendous challenge, militarily speaking. We know that in the past 3 decades, China built up its military and spent tremendous resources. And we all know that with the ultimate goal to so-called reunify Taiwan. And we also see in the past several years, China increased its so-called coercive behavior against us, toward us. For instance, become so frequent for its sorties, coming to our so-called ADIZ, and coming to our so-called 24 nautical miles in the sea, so on and so forth. So actually, militarily speaking, we did face with tremendous military pressure, particularly this pressure with kind of coercive purpose for us. So definitely we need to build up, probably not to fight a war tomorrow, but probably it's a long term. We don't know when it will happen. It's better not to happen again, but we have to be prepared for ourselves. So that's the goal. And because we know that there's a kind of asymmetric development between Taiwan and China. China has huge military force, and we are kind of small force. So how to deal with such a big threat is a daunting task, I would say. So that's why there's a strong need to increase our defense budget from increase the manpower to so-called increase our routine training or even special training or even so-called maintenance, because you use your all kind of weaponry, then you need to do the maintenance work. And you also need to procure new so-called investment, new system. So that's why contribute to why we need to so many increase our defense budget.
Mr. Wang just mentioned that the pressure should not be under the United States, but under ourselves. So what do you mean by that? Especially you mentioned there's a shortage in manpower. We know that in Taiwan, the culture does not really encourage younger people to, to join the army. So what kind of possible solution to you to this problem?
Well, that's a fantastic question. I think, first of all, there needs to be an overhaul when it comes to the training content of our soldiers. Using personal experience myself, example, I served only 4 months in the military and not just 1-year conscripts. And unfortunately, in a lot of the trainings that we do, we simply have a title when it comes to what branches we are. But in terms of specializing those weapons, I don't see that happening. And besides from that, I think we need to tackle the fundamentals. For example, the benefits of the soldiers, the salaries of the soldiers, the wages, the welfare. And we need to have, take these kind of baby steps to rebuild the reputation of our service members in our society, to let the aspiring young folks in Taiwan to understand there is a future when it comes to joining the military.
Yeah. Professor Dean, do you have anything to add up to this recruitment kind of difficulty for Taiwan?
Yeah, I would say, on the one hand, we are entering so-called aging society. Means that the few young people are able to be recruited by the militaries. So I guess our Ministry of National Defense has realized this kind of a problem, daunting task ahead. So they have adopted several measures. For instance, they hire back those already retired, or those have completed their so-called service and hire them back. And this is the first one. Second is to somewhat lower the so-called the criteria for those able to be recruited. For instance, previously those have tattoo in their skin will not be recruited, but now those with tattoo will be recruited. And the third one is to reorganize and remobilize those reserved force, so that in addition to so-called frontline, the soldiers, we mobilize reserve force able to put in the second line, and able to to resupply to the front line. So I know our Ministry of National Defense, they have realized the problem we as a society we face, and they do their every effort to to increase the manpowers able to effectively to do the defense job.
Okay, let's come back to the budget issue. So how much military investment do you guys think that is enough to ensure security in the Taiwan Strait? Is allocating 3% of GDP sufficient, or should it be raised to even like 5%? So how should Taiwan's defense investment trend be assessed? Will it continue to rise without scaling back, Mr. Wang?
Number is very important politically to show our nation's resolve and also its attitude when it comes to the changing geopolitics dynamics that we're facing it. But when it comes to what numbers precisely are efficient for our troops, I would look at some of the minuscule figures. For example, what are the retention rate for the forces? Right? The preparedness of our reserve components, and also the availability of the existing materials and assets and articles that we have. Right. So and also military expenditure per capita. Those are the things that I will focus upon. And I do believe is somehow 3% can actually raise all these figures to somewhat of a acceptable level that we can constitute an effective deterrence. Then I think 3% is enough. If it's more than 3%, I think it is up to the government's job to try to not only convince the legislative yuan, but also to convince the people that we need additional resources. We need these finite resources to be able to build up our military. Yeah.
So far, I mean, the current rate is around 2.45%, right? So you think that's not enough? And also another question for you, kind of follow up, is that if it's raised to 3%, don't you think that's gonna excludes other budgets for, to dealing with issues like aging society or like low fertility rates or those kind of problems, also very urgent in Taiwan?
Thank you for that question. So I do think, number one, assuming if the existing budget doesn't change, there are a lot of ways I think government can save money. I think, unfortunately, from my perspective, and I do believe from the perspective of the majority in the LY, that unfortunately this government, with its energy policy, has accumulated a massive amount of subsidies that every year that we have to devote into. For us, it's about nuclear power, but for them, it's mostly about natural gas and also about other forms of energies, right? So imagine if somehow we can correct those mistakes, then there will be available funds to implement whatever the military desires. So I do believe there are other ways. By the way, also you have overtaxation. But basically just means that the government severely underestimated the amount of tax income that they can have. For those additional income, I do believe the government has a lot of capacity to do what they want.
Professor Ding?
Yeah, I would say the defense need a really heavy investment, frankly speaking, particularly if you want to build a so-called modern military. There's no doubt in the past 4 or 5 decades, Taiwan has enjoyed so-called peace dividend. And on the one hand, we scale down because peace dividend, so we continue to scale down our military size. On the other hand, training becomes not so rigorous, and the investment in R&D and the procurement also declining. But now the things reverse now, so it's hard to say, the 3% is enough or not. But the basic question is, the more you need to have manpower, the more rigorous training you need to have, and the more R&D and the so-called procurement you need to have, then definitely you need more money. Because I said, it's very costly to build a so-called modern military. Definitely, if we look at the United States, right? The U.S. force is regarded as the most modern force. Then how much defense budget, right? It's more than 3% of the GDP. So definitely is correlated, yeah.
So you would suggest that 3% is the minimum requirements for Taiwan to improve its defense forces. You agree with this notion?
I would say, I don't want to say the so-called numerical target, but the basic principle, I would say, the more money probably will be more needed, yeah.
Okay, Professor Ding, I have a follow-up for you. Is that which new weapons to you should Taiwan actively seek from the U.S., such as Aegis destroyers, F-35 fighter jets, drones, P-8A anti-submarine reconnaissance aircraft, or like a KC-135 aerial refueling tankers?
We have kind of two schools of debate in Taiwan. One school say we are developing so-called asymmetric capability. Asymmetric means that because facing China's huge military force, so we need to build a force able to survive and able to very mobile, and have so-called lethal strike capability. But on the other hand, we see, the war has not been erupt, and we don't know when it will erupt. But we see, China take a very coercive approach. On the daily basis, fly into our ADIZ, and we need to scramble. So for those advocating so-called asymmetric capability, they don't see a need for so-called modern fighters. They don't see a need for so-called large-scale destroyer missiles, warships. But when you deal with the so-called China's coercive behaviors, you need to have a modern fighter to scramble, and you need to have a somewhat large-scale military ships, destroyer to repel, to withhold, China's incoming so-called warship or fighter jet. So means that what we need to procure is that probably we need to combine these two elements into our consideration. On the one hand, we need to procure some amount of the so-called fighter jets, or somewhat the warships, not just the small gunboat and the missile boat. We need to somewhat certain amount of the large-scale warship. On the other hand, we need to procure so-called asymmetric-oriented, like able to survivable mobility, strong mobility, and lethal precision strike. So we need to have, when we doing the procurement, we need to put these two elements into our consideration.
Mr. Wang?
Yeah, just to echo the professor, the dilemma for our defense is always about preparing for the D-Day scenario and also for the gray zone scenario. So I think the professor has done a very good job in kind of elaborating. It will always be a question not only for the military but also for the government overall. What is the golden ratio when it comes to balancing asymmetric and symmetric capabilities? Not naming specific weapon types. So, for example, if you have fighter jets that can do vertical takeoff, then it increases the survivability. When we don't have sufficient capacity, perhaps in the later stages of the war, to repair our own airfields. Those are the type of weapons that we need to have serious considerations.
There's actually another issue when it comes to Taiwan making large-scale purchases of these major military assets. That is, who will operate them? Costs related to personal training and challenges such as manpower shortages, you two mentioned already, would become additional burdens. So do we have any suggestions on how to address these issues, Professor?
Well, yeah, this question involves so-called manpower issue. As I said earlier, our Ministry of National Defense have taken some measures to address this problem. For instance, they rehire back those complete their military service, and the somewhat lower so-called criteria for the recruitment, so on and so forth. This is the first issue, to increase the manpower so that we have sufficient manpower to operate the weapon system. Then the second is that our trainings become somewhat rigorous. For instance, for those reserve force, during my days when I was recalled, I spent one day in the barrack and just watching the TV and went home. I never fired a shot, a bullets from any machine gun, whatever weapon systems. But now reserve force they have to stay in the barrack for training for at least 1 week or 7 to 10 days, and they have to fire whatever the weapon system to have so-called real practice and to have first-hand experience. Extremely important. So that all these measures can improve the so-called their so-called self capability, able to operate the weapon, all kind of weapon system. It's extremely important.
Well, sometimes manpower, if we have sufficient of that, we can handle the operation problem. But other times, weapons are so advanced, right? So you people need to find, professionals from the United States, for example, to help us to learn how to use those. So what's your suggestion of this kind of advanced weapons and kind of see as a whole package training?
Well, I would say, in our so-called increased defense budget, certain amount will be allocated to those so-called reserve force, because during the old days, in our reserve force only operate those so-called very outdated weapon systems, frankly speaking. So now we need to allocate certain amount defense budget to procure so-called, those weapon systems used by the frontline soldier and the force, so that the reserve force able to operate the so-called modern weapon system. So these are the quite important to improve our so-called overall fighting and the defense capability. And also our reserve force will stay when they are called back for the training. They will stay longer than the time when I used to be. So overall, I would say those will be increase our so-called fighting and the defense capability. And I guess those are the important measures to be taken.
Mr. Wang?
Yeah, there are many ways for us, if somehow it is a little bit difficult in the short term to drastically increase the welfares of the service members. Well, there are several methods that I think we can tackle this. I mean, number one is definitely automation, right? So when it comes about procuring weapons that are more advanced, that doesn't require that many crew to operate compared to the older models, But there's also another thing that I believe the military should start implementing is to expand its civilian workforce. For a considerable amount of time, and from my understanding from some of the friends in the military, is that you have soldiers who are supposed to be in the combat units, but a lot of times, unfortunately, they're doing mundane jobs, bureaucratic paperworks and all that. So there are several ways right now that we can kind of sort of tackle these issues by having the soldiers who are in those combat forces to do what they're supposedly been doing, and also let the other mundane tasks to be, you can say, outsourced or to be delegated to other civilian components.
Okay, at the same time, Reuters, citing sources familiar with the matter, exclusively reported that Taiwan is considering purchasing between $7 and $10 billion worth of weapons from the U.S. The potential acquisition includes Harpoon anti-ship coastal defense cruise missiles, CDCM, and rockets for the high mobility artillery rockets system. People call it the HIMARS system. The move comes as Taiwan seeks to secure the support of President Trump's administration amid continued military pressure from China. However, Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense declined to comment on this report. So, Professor Dean, how effective are Harpoon coastal defense cruise missiles and rockets for the high mobility artillery rocket system in enhancing Taiwan's military capabilities?
Well, I would say HIMARS, so-called high mobility, the rocket force, now has been used in Ukraine battlefield, and has been operated by Ukraine force against Russian force, and it has been tested to be a very effective platform. They have been ruined, destroyed many of the Russian force. So it has been fully tested. It's quite a useful, effective weapon system. Then for the Harpoon, also has been used in the past 3-4 decades, and they have 3 versions: air launch, ground launch, and the sea launch, and quite a precision, lethal anti-ship weapon system. So I would say these 2 weapon systems has been fully tested in the battleground, and should be no problem at all. But only concern is that we should assume that China also fully aware of these 2 weapon systems, and like Harpoon missiles, they need to kind of electronic system. So China may develop kind of a electronic system to interfere or influence the electronic signals, so make it effective. So this is an issue we need to really take care about it. Yeah.
Mr. Wang, the report also mentioned that Taiwan has proposed a special defense budget prioritizing the procurement of specific items. And now I want to mention air defense. So do you think that the air defense currently is Taiwan's biggest vulnerability in a potential cross-strait conflict?
Oh yes, I certainly think so. One of the biggest, I would say, revolutionary development is the fact that we simply do not have, I would say right now, a very cost-effective way to kind of deal with, for example, a potential POA drone floods coming into Taiwan, for example. I mean, the POA has been kind of focusing on how do they waste Taiwan's air defense ammunition, right, before the real forces comes in. Automation has been one of the ways they would do it. Combining civil defense hybrid. You can have a lot of drones coming together, and then we have to shoot our precious missiles towards them. So I do believe that is something that we need to definitely address.
Aside from Taiwan, President Trump has also demanded that NATO allies increase their defense spending to 5% of their GDPs. However, out of NATO's 32 member states, as we observe closely, only 23 have met the 2% GDP military spending target, not much better than Taiwan's case. So how should we interpret Trump's global military strategy, and what kind of consequence, this might lead to a geopolitical risks, kind of arise from this arms races? Professor, you think so?
I would say, this on the one hand reflect, so-called the kind of a change of the mindset as the superpower in the global orders. But on the other hand, so this the so-called pressure is kind of the outcome of this kind of mindset, I would say. But will this create a so-called arms race? I would say probably not much, because from our side, we see in the past 3-4 decades, China increased defense budget and built a military force rapidly, and it become a challenge and a threat for us, and not just for us, and also for other countries.
Mr. Wang?
Yeah, so I think the professor mentioned a very key terminology, right? Burden sharing. This is something that I do believe, it has been discussed for a substantial amount of time within U.S. domestic politics, and I think there is also a recognition that yes, indeed, the U.S. forces, I think, around the world is being overstretched. There is a need to refocus or reorientate to perhaps what the current Trump administration see as the priority, which is China, for example. So yeah, I do think there is legitimate concerns from the Trump administration when it comes to you have not many, you only have 23 out of 32 members that meet the 2% requirement. So I think, yeah, it is time for a lot of countries to kind of realize this and realize that, yes, they have taken a lot of peace dividends from the Americans for the past decades, right? So when it comes to global risk of arms race, inevitably, at least numerically, you will see as these nations increase their defense budget, it depends on what priorities they are, right? Some nations will say, I have insufficient armor elements, I have insufficient Air Force elements. So you will absolutely see a rise of arms sales. But does that mean that all the other countries suddenly will explode in terms of their defense spending? I think that remains to be seen.
Okay, Mr. Wang, Professor Ding, thank you for great insights in the show.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Like our show, subscribe to Taiwan Talks. See you soon.